What happens when a sheriff's past rises on a dusty street? When an enemy thought dead returns with a gun, the town holds its breath. Can he outsmart fate or become its prey? This is a story of how shadows of the past turned into a duel where everything's at stake. Stick around to see how it unfolded. Hey listener, how's it hanging? And where are you tuning in from today? The sun beat down on Redstone, a speck of a town perched on the edge of a desert so vast it seemed to swallow hope itself. A new sheriff had rolled in 6 months back, a man named Eli Tanner, who carried himself with the quiet grit of someone who'd seen too much, but said too little. Tall, lean, with a jawline sharp enough to cut leather, he'd taken the badge after the last sheriff got drunk and shot his own horse by mistake. Eli was no stranger to settling disputes, chicken theft, bar brawls, or whose cow wandered into whose patch of scrub. He handled it all with a steady hand and a stare that could make a rattlesnake think twice. The townsfolk liked him well enough, though they didn't know much about him. Eli wasn't one for small talk, and his past was a locked box he never opened. Born an orphan, or so he claimed, he'd drifted from town to town before landing in Redstone. Behind his back, folks called him the Sheriff Without Roots, a nickname that stung more than he'd ever admit. They respected him, sure, but trust was another matter. In a place like Redstone, where secrets were currency, a man with none was either a saint or a liar. Eli's days followed a rhythm. Morning rounds through the town's single street, a nod to the baker, a warning to the saloon's rowdiest drunks, and a quick check on the jail, which was usually empty. He'd sit outside his office, hat tipped low, watching dust swirl in the wind while townsfolk went about their lives. Old Mrs. Carter, who ran the general store, swore he was the best sheriff they'd had in years. He don't talk much, but he don't need to, she'd say, handing out penny candy to kids. Others weren't so sure. Jake, the blacksmith, would mutter over his anvil, "Man's too quiet. Hide something. Mark my words." Eli didn't care for the whispers. He'd built a life here, fragile as it was, and he aimed to keep it. Every night he'd sit on the porch of his small office, cleaning his revolver and sipping coffee that tasted like burnt dirt. He'd watch the stars, wondering if a man could ever outrun who he'd been. Redstone was his chance to start clean, to be more than a shadow of his past. But in a town this small, where every stranger's face was studied like a wanted poster, Eli knew his secrets wouldn't stay buried forever. The truth was, Eli hadn't always been a lawman. Years ago, he'd ridden with men who'd make Redstone's worst drunks look like choir boys. He'd left that life behind, or so he thought, trading blood for a badge. But the weight of those years lingered in the way he checked his back trail, the way his hand never strayed far from his gun. For now, Redstone was calm, and Eli aimed to keep it that way. He just hoped the past would stay where it belonged, far from this dusty corner of nowhere. "Evening, Sheriff," called Tom, the saloon's piano player, as he passed by one night. "You ever going to tell us where you came from?" Eli tipped his hat, a half smile tugging at his lips. "Ain't much to tell, Tom. Just a man trying to keep the peace." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "Peace, huh? In Redstone. Good luck with that." Eli watched him disappear into the saloon's glow, the faint sound of laughter spilling out. He leaned back, the chair creaking under him, and let the night settle. Peace was a fragile thing, and he knew better than most how quickly it could shatter. Dust swirled like a bad omen when a lone rider appeared on Redstone's horizon, his horse plodding slow under the midday sun. The man's silhouette cut a grim figure against the haze, his hat pulled low, a long coat flapping like a vulture's wings. Eli Tanner stood outside his office, squinting as the stranger approached, his hand resting easy on his gun belt. Something about the way the man sat his saddle, too deliberate, too heavy, set Eli's nerves on edge. By the time the rider reached the town's edge, half of Redstone was peeking from windows or lingering by the saloon, curious but wary. The stranger dismounted in front of the saloon, his boots kicking up puffs of dirt. A jagged scar ran from his left eyebrow to his jaw, twisting his face into a permanent scowl. He tied his horse, slow and methodical, then scanned the street like a hawk sizing up prey. Whispers spread faster than wildfire. "That's Caleb Voss," hissed Jake the blacksmith to a cluster of men by the general store. "Heard he gunned down a whole gang in Tucson. Ain't here for no picnic." Eli stayed put, watching, his gut telling him this wasn't just another drifter passing through. Caleb strode into the saloon, the doors swinging shut behind him. Inside, the chatter died as he ordered a whiskey, his voice low and rough like gravel underfoot. "Heard you got a new sheriff," he said to the barman, who nodded nervously, wiping a glass that didn't need wiping. "Eli Tanner, right? Man with no past." The words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Nobody answered, but the name sent a jolt through Tom, the piano player, who fumbled a note and went quiet. Eli heard the whispers from a kid who'd run to his office, breathless. "Sheriff, they're saying that man's Caleb Voss. Saying he's got a score to settle." Eli's face didn't change, but his hand tightened on the coffee mug he held. Caleb Voss. The name was a ghost from a life he'd buried, tied to blood and betrayal. Years ago, Caleb had gunned down Eli's parents in a border town feud, leaving a boy to grow up with nothing but rage. Now, Caleb was here, claiming a debt Eli didn't owe. The past hadn't just caught up, it had kicked down the door. Eli set the mug down, his jaw tight. "Time to meet an old friend," he muttered, stepping toward the saloon, the weight of his badge heavier than ever. The saloon's lamplight flickered as Redstone's gossip mill churned faster than a stagecoach at full gallop. By evening, every soul in town knew Caleb Voss wasn't just passing through. He'd come for Eli Tanner. Folks gathered in knots outside the general store, their voices a low hum of excitement and dread. Some demanded Eli face Voss in a duel, claiming a sheriff's job was to protect the town's honor. Others, like Mrs. Carter, shook their heads, muttering that no man with sense would tangle with a killer like Voss. "He's got eyes like a wolf," she told the baker, who nodded grimly while kneading dough. In the saloon, bets were already flying. Tom, the piano player, scribbled odds on a scrap of paper. 3-1, Eli wouldn't last 10 seconds. "Sheriff's got a steady hand," Tom said to a cluster of drunks. "But Voss, he's a walking graveyard." The barman, polishing the same glass for the third time, chuckled nervously. "Hope Eli's revolver don't jam in this dust." The joke landed flat, but it echoed what everyone was thinking. A storm was brewing, and Eli was at its center. Eli stood outside his office, leaning against a post, watching the town buzz like a kicked beehive. He overheard Jake the blacksmith telling a crowd, "Sheriff's tough, but he's no match for Voss. Man's got no roots, no reason to stand and fight." The words cut deep, but Eli kept his face stone cold, his fingers brushing the badge pinned to his vest. He wasn't one for heroics, but running wasn't an option either, not with every eye in Redstone watching. Inside, Eli's mind raced. He'd spent years dodging the shadow of Caleb Voss, convincing himself the past was dead. Now, it was sitting in the saloon, drinking whiskey and waiting. The townsfolk's chatter didn't help. Half wanted blood, the other half wanted a show. Eli smirked, muttering to himself, "Hope my gun's cleaner than their consciences." The irony wasn't lost on him. A sheriff with a killer's past, now judged by a town that loved a spectacle more than justice. As night fell, Eli caught a glimpse of Voss through the saloon's window, sitting alone, his scar catching the light like a warning. The town was splitting, picking sides in a fight that wasn't theirs. Eli straightened, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "Let 'em talk," he said under his breath. Words don't pull triggers. But deep down, he knew the real fight wasn't with Voss. It was with the man he'd tried to leave behind. The moon hung low over Redstone, casting a pale glow that made the town look like a ghost of itself. Eli Tanner sat on the sagging porch of his office, a knife in one hand, a whetstone in the other, scraping steel with a rhythm that matched his racing thoughts. The air was thick with the scent of dust and distant rain, but no storm would come to wash away the trouble brewing. He'd spent years trying to outrun the life he'd left behind, and now it was sitting in the saloon, sipping whiskey like it owned the place. Eli's deputy, a wiry kid named Sam who barely shaved, leaned against the railing, tossing pebbles into the dirt. "You gonna face him, Sheriff?" Sam asked, his voice half curious, half teasing. "Or you planning to ride out before dawn? Ain't no shame in it." Eli didn't look up, just kept sharpening his knife, the blade glinting in the moonlight. "Sam, if I'm gonna die tomorrow, at least let me look good doing it. Go fetch me a comb." Sam snorted, shaking his head, but the joke didn't hide the truth. Eli was cornered, and they both knew it. Across town, the saloon's laughter spilled into the night, but it felt hollow, like a crowd pretending not to smell smoke. Eli could hear the whispers from here, folks calling him a coward, a drifter, a man who'd fold under Voss's shadow. Their words stung, not because they were wrong, but because they were half right. He hadn't wanted this life, this badge, this town. He'd taken the job to stay invisible, not to play hero. But Caleb Voss wasn't a man you could ignore, and the weight of old blood debts was heavier than any badge. Eli set the knife down, his hands steady but his mind a mess. He thought of his parents, their faces blurred by time, their lives snuffed out by Voss's gun in a feud he barely understood as a boy. Revenge had burned in him once, hot and wild, but years on the trail had dulled it to a cold ache. Now, with Voss in Redstone, that ache was waking up, sharp and mean. "Ain't about them anymore," he muttered, staring at the stars. "It's about me." Sam kicked another pebble, glancing at Eli. "You talking to yourself now, Sheriff? That's a bad sign." Eli smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Go home, Sam. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As Sam shuffled off, Eli leaned back, the chair creaking under him. He wasn't ready to face Voss, but he was done running. The saloon's doors creaked as Eli Tanner pushed through, the hum of conversation dropping like a stone in a well. Every eye turned, but Eli's gaze locked on Caleb Voss, who sat at a corner table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey glowing amber in the lamplight. Voss didn't look up, just swirled his glass, the scar on his face catching shadows like a map of bad decisions. Eli crossed the room, his boots thudding on the warped floorboards, and pulled out a chair opposite the man who'd haunted his nightmares for 20 years. "Sheriff," Voss said, his voice low like a snake sliding through gravel. "Heard you keep this town tidy. That true?" Eli sat, slow and deliberate, his hands resting on the table, inches from his gun. "Tidy enough," he replied, nodding to the barman for a drink. "Till you rode in." The room stayed quiet, every ear straining, but the two men spoke like they were alone, their words sharp with history. Voss leaned back, a smirk tugging at his scarred lip. "You're still sore about that business years ago, ain't you? Thought a badge might make you forget." Eli's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "A badge don't erase blood, Voss. You know that better than most." The whiskey arrived, and Eli took a slow sip, letting the burn steady his nerves. The air between them crackled, heavy with hate and something else. Respect, maybe, for men who'd both seen too much to lie about it. "You here for me, or just passing through?" Eli asked, his eyes never leaving Voss's. The older man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "A debt's a debt, Tanner. Your folks owed me, and now you're wearing their tab." Eli's fingers twitched, but he kept them still, his mind racing through memories of a burning homestead. A boy left with nothing but scars. Voss's calm grated on him, like the man was daring him to draw first. The saloon's crowd started to murmur, sensing the tension but not the stakes. Tom, the piano player, hovered nearby, pretending to tune a key. "Don't do nothing stupid, Sheriff," he muttered under his breath, but Eli ignored him. He leaned forward, his voice low. "You want my blood, Voss? You'll earn it, but don't think I'm the kid you left behind." Voss met his gaze, unblinking, and raised his glass. "To old debts, then?" he said, and drank deep. Eli didn't move, but inside he felt the storm closing in. Redstone woke to a morning so still it felt like the world was waiting for a spark to ignite it. The main street, usually alive with the clatter of wagons and the chatter of early risers, was hushed, as if the town itself knew what was coming. Eli Tanner stood outside his office, his hat casting a shadow over eyes that hadn't slept. The air was heavy, thick with heat and the promise of trouble, and every glance from a passerby felt like a jab to his ribs. At the blacksmith shop, Jake hammered horseshoes with more force than needed, each strike ringing out like a countdown. "Sheriff's gonna face Voss," he told a cluster of men, his voice low but eager. "Reckon we'll see who's got the faster draw." Across the street, the barman stacked bottles behind the counter, muttering about blood staining his floorboards. Even the kids, usually chasing each other with sticks, stood quiet, watching the street like it was a stage. Eli walked toward the saloon, his boots kicking up dust that hung in the air like a bad memory. He felt the town's eyes on his back, their whispers trailing him like shadows. "Hope these boots hold up," he muttered, a wry smile tugging at his lips. The thought was absurd, but it kept his mind off the weight of his revolver, heavy on his hip. He wasn't sure if he was walking to a fight or a funeral, but either way, Redstone was ready for a show. Inside the general store, Mrs. Carter packed supplies for a rancher, her hands shaking slightly. "Eli's a good man," she said to no one in particular, "but Voss ain't human. He's a devil with a gun." The rancher nodded, but his eyes were on the street where Voss had stepped out, leaning against a post, cleaning his nails with a knife. The scar on his face seemed to pulse in the sunlight, a warning no one missed. Eli stopped in the middle of the street, his shadow stretching long behind him. He could feel the town holding its breath, waiting for him to make a move. The saloon's doors swung lazily, and Tom, the piano player, poked his head out, his face pale. "You sure about this, Sheriff?" he called, voice cracking. Eli didn't answer, just adjusted his hat and kept walking. The crowd parted, their murmurs fading into silence. Redstone wasn't just watching, it was betting on blood, and Eli knew it. He smirked, thinking, "Least I'll give him a story to tell." The saloon was dim, its air thick with the stench of stale whiskey and unwashed men, when Caleb Voss leaned across the table, his voice low enough to make the barman flinch. Eli sat opposite, his fingers steady on his glass, but his pulse thrummed like a war drum. Voss's scar seemed to twist as he spoke, his words slicing through the haze of tension. "Your pa wasn't just some dirt farmer, Tanner," he said, eyes glinting like a blade catching light. "He was my partner, till he crossed me." Eli's grip tightened, but he kept his face blank, years of practice holding him steady. "Partner?" he said, voice calm but sharp. "That why you gunned him down. Bad business deal." Voss chuckled, a sound like dry leaves crunching underfoot. "He owed me more than money, boy. He promised me a stake and a claim, then sold it out from under me, left me with nothing but a bullet for him and your ma." The words hit Eli like a fist, cracking the story he'd carried since he was 10. The saloon crowd pretended not to listen, but every ear was tuned to the corner table. Tom, the piano player, hovered near the bar, his fingers twitching like he wanted to play a dirge. Eli leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "You're saying my folks deserved it? That's your truth." Voss shrugged, sipping his whiskey. "Ain't about deserve, it's about what happens when trust breaks. You ought to know that, Sheriff." Eli's mind reeled, memories of his parents, fuzzy, half-forgotten, clashing with Voss's story. He'd grown up thinking it was a random raid, a senseless killing. Now, Voss was painting it as a betrayal, a debt gone sour. Doubt crept in, cold and heavy, but the town outside didn't care about truth. They wanted blood, a duel to talk about for years. Eli could hear their whispers through the walls, feel their eyes waiting for him to crack. "You want me to draw on you," Eli said, not a question. Voss's smirk widened, but his eyes stayed hard. "I want what's owed, Tanner. You wearing that badge, don't change the debt." Eli pushed his glass away, standing slow, his chair scraping the floor. "Then we settle it tomorrow, noon." Voss nodded like they'd just agreed on a price for cattle. As Eli walked out, the saloon silence broke into murmurs. He stepped into the night, his smirk bitter. "Truth or not," he muttered, "this town's gonna get its show." Eli Tanner sat alone in his office, the flicker of a single lamp casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. His revolver lay disassembled on the desk, each piece gleaming from a fresh cleaning, the smell of gun oil sharp in the air. He worked methodically, brushing dust from the cylinder, but his mind was a tangle of memories and doubts. Voss's words from the saloon echoed, each one a splinter under his skin. His father, a partner, a traitor. Eli had built his life on hating Voss, but now the ground beneath that hate felt shaky. He ran a cloth over the barrel, picturing his parents' faces, his mother's smile, his father's calloused hands. Were they liars, like Voss claimed? Or was Voss just twisting the knife? Eli's fingers paused, his eyes fixed on the gun. "Am I fighting for them?" he muttered, "or just for me?" The question hung unanswered, heavy as the badge pinned to his vest. He'd chosen this life to bury the past, not to dig it up, but Redstone didn't care about his soul-searching. Outside, the town was quiet, but Eli knew it was a lie. The saloon was still buzzing, bets piling up like firewood for a blaze. Jake the blacksmith had spread word that Voss was sharpening a knife at the livery, slow and deliberate, like a man who enjoyed the wait. "He's gonna carve Eli up," Jake had told the barman, who nodded grimly while counting bottles. Even Sam, Eli's deputy, had stopped by earlier, his usual jokes replaced by a nervous glance. You sure about this, Sheriff? Ain't too late to ride out. Eli had just waved him off, but the kid's words lingered. Eli reassembled the revolver, each click of metal sounding louder than it should. He spun the cylinder, checking its weight, and slid it into his holster. Across town, Voss was likely doing the same, his own rituals honed by years of killing. Eli didn't know if he could outdraw him, but he knew one thing. Running wasn't an option, not with Redstone watching, not with his parents' ghosts whispering in his head. He stood, stretching his shoulders, and caught his reflection in the window, tired eyes, a face too young for this kind of weight. He stepped outside, the night air cool against his skin. Tomorrow's gonna hurt, he said to himself, a wry grin breaking through. Least I'll know why. The stars above offered no answers, but the gun on his hip felt like the only truth left. The sun climbed to its peak over Redstone, turning the air into a furnace that shimmered with heat. The main street was empty, save for the dust swirling like a restless spirit as Eli Tanner stepped out from his office, his boots crunching on the packed earth. His hat sat low, shading eyes that scanned the crowd gathering on porches and behind barrels. Faces peered from every corner, Mrs. Carter clutching her shawl, Jake the blacksmith wiping sweat from his brow, kids perched on a fence like vultures. Even the town's lone dog, usually yapping at shadows, lay silent in the shade. Eli's revolver hung heavy at his hip, its grip worn smooth by years of use. He walked to the center of the street, each step deliberate, his heart pounding but his hands steady. Across from him, Caleb Voss emerged from the saloon, his long coat flapping in the faint breeze, his scar stark against his weathered face. The two men stood 50 paces apart, the distance feeling both endless and too short. The crowd's whispers died, leaving only the creak of a sign swinging above the general store. Eli's mind flashed to the night before, cleaning his gun, wrestling with Voss's story about his father. Truth or lies, it didn't matter now. The town wanted blood, and he was done running. Voss's eyes locked on his, cold and unyielding, like a predator sizing up its mark. You ready to pay up, Tanner? Voss called, his voice cutting through the silence. Eli smirked, his voice steady. Only thing I owe you is a long walk to hell. A few in the crowd chuckled, but the tension didn't break. Their hands hovered near their guns, fingers twitching, waiting for the other to flinch. Eli felt the sun burning his neck, the weight of every stare pressing on him. He thought of his parents, of the boy he'd been, of the badge he wore now. Time slowed, each breath stretching long, the world narrowing to the glint of Voss's revolver. A crow cawed somewhere, sharp and sudden, and the street exploded into motion. Two shots cracked so close they sounded like one. Dust kicked up, thick and choking, hiding the outcome as the crowd gasped. Eli's ears rang, his chest tight, his hand still gripping the gun. Voss stood frozen, his own weapon raised, smoke curling from the barrel. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat, and nobody moved, waiting for one of them to fall. The dust settled slow, like a curtain dropping on Redstone's main street, revealing two figures still standing in the haze. Eli Tanner's chest heaved, his revolver hot in his hand, a sharp sting burning his left arm where Voss's bullet had grazed him. Across the street, Caleb Voss swayed, his left hand clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. The crowd's collective gasp broke into murmurs, then shouts as folks craned their necks to see who'd won. Time stretched thin, each second feeling like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. Eli's eyes stayed locked on Voss, his grip steady despite the pain shooting up his arm. He'd fired first, barely, but Voss's shot had come close enough to remind him how thin the line was between life and a pine box. Voss staggered a step, his face twisting into a grimace, but his gun stayed raised like he wasn't ready to quit. You're quick, Tanner, he rasped, blood staining his teeth. But this ain't over. Eli's jaw tightened, his voice low. Drop the gun, Voss. Don't make me finish it. The crowd pressed closer, their whispers a dull roar. Jake the blacksmith yelled, "End him, Sheriff," while Mrs. Carter clutched her shawl, muttering prayers. Eli felt their eyes, their hunger for a clean kill, but his mind flashed to Voss's story. His father's betrayal, the debt that started this mess. Was he avenging his parents or just feeding Redstone's appetite for blood? The question hung heavier than the gun in his hand. Voss coughed, a wet, ugly sound, and lowered his revolver, not out of surrender, but exhaustion. Your pa would have done the same, he said, his voice fading. chose himself over what's right. Eli stepped closer, ignoring the pain in his arm, his boots crunching in the dust. "I ain't him," he said, voice hard, "and I ain't you." He holstered his gun, a gamble that made the crowd gasp again. Voss's eyes widened, then narrowed, but he didn't raise his weapon. A long second passed, and Voss slumped to one knee, the fight draining out of him. Eli stood over him, the street silent except for the creak of a distant shutter. He'd won, but it didn't feel like victory. The crowd wanted a corpse, not a choice, and Eli knew they'd talk about this for years, some calling him brave, others a fool. He turned, blood dripping from his arm, and walked back toward his office, muttering, "Hope they enjoyed the damn show." Eli Tanner's boots left faint bloodstains on the porch of his office as he leaned against the doorframe, his wounded arm throbbing under a hastily tied bandana. The street was alive again, Redstone's crowd buzzing like flies over spilled whiskey, their voices a mix of awe and disappointment. Voss had been dragged to the doc's shack, still breathing, though nobody knew for how long. Eli's choice to let him live had split the town cleaner than a butcher's cleaver. Half called him a hero, half muttered he'd gone soft. Jake the blacksmith stormed past, spitting into the dust. "Should have finished him, Sheriff," he growled, loud enough for others to hear. "Now, Voss'll come back. Mark my words." Mrs. Carter, lingering nearby, shot Jake a glare. "He did right," she said, her voice firm. "Killin' ain't always justice." Eli ignored them both, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the desert swallowed the sun. The nickname Sheriff Without Roots was gone now, replaced by whispers of the man who spared Voss. He wasn't sure which was worse, Inside his office, Sam, the deputy, was pacing, his face a mix of relief and nerves. "You crazy, Sheriff?" he asked, tossing a rag to clean the blood. "Letting him walk away like that? Town's gonna chew you up for it." Eli caught the rag, wincing as he pressed it to his arm. "They wanted a show, Sam," he said, his voice dry. "Gave 'em one. Ain't my job to make 'em happy." Sam shook his head, but a grin crept out. "Reckon they'll talk about this till we're all dust." Eli sat, the chair creaking under him, and poured a shot of whiskey from a bottle he kept for rough days. The duel had settled nothing, not really. Voss's words about his father still gnawed at him, a wound deeper than the graze on his arm. But standing over Voss, gun still hot, Eli had realized something. He wasn't just fighting for his parents' ghosts. He'd fought to prove he wasn't like Voss or his father, a man defined by debts and blood. The badge on his chest felt heavier now, but it fit better too. Outside, the town settled into its usual rhythm, but the air had changed. Folks nodded to Eli as they passed, some with respect, others with suspicion. He didn't care. Redstone had its story, and he had his truth. "Let 'em talk," he muttered, sipping his whiskey. "They'll find another fool to bet on soon enough." The sun dipped below Redstone's horizon, painting the sky a bruised purple as Eli Tanner sat on the saloon's porch, a bottle of whiskey cradled in his good hand. His wounded arm, bandaged now, ached with every move, but the pain felt honest, like a debt paid in full. The town had settled into an uneasy quiet, the day's drama fading into chatter over card games and beer. Voss was still alive, the doc said, but he'd be riding out soon, or carried out depending on luck. Eli didn't care which, as long as the man stayed gone. He took a slow sip, the burn of the whiskey grounding him. The street was empty now, save for a stray dog sniffing at a barrel. Folks no longer whispered "Sheriff Without Roots" behind his back. They'd traded it for "the man who faced Voss" and walked away. But respect came with a price. Eli could feel it in the way people watched him, wary, like he was a storm that might break again. He'd given Redstone its spectacle, but it hadn't filled the hole inside him. Sam ambled up, his deputy badge glinting in the fading light. "You look like you're thinking too hard, Sheriff," he said, leaning against a post. "Town's calling you a legend now. Ain't that something?" Eli snorted, his smirk bitter. "Legends are just stories folks tell to feel better about their own messes. I'm just a man who didn't die today." Sam laughed, but his eyes were serious. "You're more than that, Eli. You know it." Eli didn't answer, just stared into the desert where the last light clung to the dunes. He'd faced Voss, faced his past, and come out standing, but the victory felt hollow. His parents' deaths, Voss's betrayal, his father's secrets, they were all still there, heavy as the badge he wore. He'd chosen to spare Voss, not for mercy, but because killing him wouldn't erase the questions. Now he was left with himself, a man who'd built a life on running, only to find he couldn't outrun his own shadow. The saloon's laughter drifted out, a reminder that Redstone would move on, spinning new tales. Eli set the bottle down, his fingers brushing the badge. "Town got its show," he muttered, standing up. "But I got my curse." He walked into the night, the desert stretching endless before him, knowing he'd carry this day forever, half triumph, half regret, all his own. The desert night wrapped Redstone in a quiet so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. Eli Tanner stood alone at the edge of town, his silhouette blending with the shadows of the dunes, the whiskey bottle left behind on the saloon's porch. His arm still throbbed under the bandage, a reminder of the duel that had changed him, more than it changed Redstone. The town would keep spinning its stories about the sheriff who faced Caleb Voss and walked away, about the man who chose a badge over blood. But for Eli, the story wasn't about glory. It was about staring down his past and realizing some ghosts don't die, no matter how fast you draw. He thought of his parents, their faces clearer now, softened by time, but sharpened by Voss's words. Were they traitors, like Voss claimed, or just folks caught in a bad deal? Eli didn't know, and maybe he never would. What he did know was that he'd chosen to be more than their mistakes, more than Voss's vengeance. The badge on his chest wasn't just a shield, it was a promise to be better, even if Redstone didn't care. He smirked, kicking a pebble into the dark. "Guess I'm stuck with myself now," he muttered the desert, swallowing his words. The town slept behind him, its lights dim, its whispers fading. Tomorrow Jake would hammer horseshoes, Mrs. Carter would sell her goods, and Sam would crack jokes pretending the duel never happened. But Eli would carry it, a weight heavier than his gun, lighter than his regrets. He turned back toward his office, the stars above cold and unyielding. Redstone had its legend, but Eli had his truth. A man who'd faced his past and found it was just as broken as he was. Well, folks, that's the tale of Eli Tanner and the day Redstone held its breath. Thanks for riding along with us through the dust and drama of the Wild West. Your time means the world, and we hope this story left you thinking, maybe even chuckling, about the choices we make when the past comes knocking. Where are you listening from tonight? Some dusty corner like Redstone or a city far from the desert? What would you have done in Eli's boots? Faced Voss or walked away? And what's the one truth you'd fight for, no matter the cost? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep the campfire burning. Till next time, keep your hat low and your heart steady.